Afternoon class, my name is Professor Tyler Virts, and I will be teaching you for about 15 minutes about Japanese feudalism. So, the first thing I'd like you to consider is this current map of Japan. This is what Japan looks like at this very moment. As you can see, one united nation with a capital and several cities dotted along the landscape. However, for a great deal of the past millennia, Japan has looked more like this. And that is because Japan was run by a series of emperors, shoguns, daimyos, and the like. And this is because this was Japan's feudal era, in which they adhered to a very strong class system. Now you can see the class system demonstrated right here. At the very bottom, we have merchants. Above that, we have artisans, then the peasants, who work the farmland. We have ronin, which is basically a samurai without a master. And above them, we have the samurai, who are basically an honored warrior class in Japan at that time. Above them are the daimyo, who were the noble lords. Shogun were the most powerful class in all of Japan during this time. And the emperor was at the very top, although their role was mainly as a figurehead and religious leader at this time. So, at the very bottom of our little pyramid, we have the merchants. And in most periods of feudal society, merchants would be considered they would be higher than peasants. But in Japanese society, merchants were actually considered to be the lowest in Japanese society, since they didn't produce anything on their own. They only sold things that other classes had produced and created. So they were considered bottom feeders, or parasites. During this time, it was not a very honorable thing to be called a merchant. In fact, it was more of an insult than anything else. And most of these merchants consisted of traveling shopkeepers and, travelers and the like. Above them are the artisans, and these are people who created any kind of product. They were artists, they were architects, they made buildings, they were people who created swords and weapons and armor for samurai, although no matter how strong of a craftsman that you were not considered very high on the feudal ladder, since you weren't considered to be making anything particularly important. Above them are the peasants and farmers, which in most feudal societies were at the bottom of the pyramid. But in this era, they were considered more noble than the artisans and the merchants because they produced the food on which the entire society was based. However, despite how honored they were in name, they were also very much abused by the landowners that basically controlled their lives, the daimyo at this point, who would basically disallow them from moving up or down on the ladder at any point, and they would inflict heavy taxes on the peasants who were working under their land. Now, the ronin are a warrior class, much like the samurai. However, the main difference between a ronin and a samurai is that a ronin does not have a master. They don't have anyone that they work under. A ronin is basically a freelance warrior that goes about doing their own business. Most of the time, ronin are considered dishonorable because when a samurai loses their master, they are expected to commit seppuku, or ritualistic suicide. A ronin, by definition, means that they are a dishonorable figure, and they are someone who disavowed their oaths. Now, most ronin turn to a life of crime since they are not typically allowed to go up against typical merchants, peasants, and the like. They're not allowed to move up or down on the ladder. So a great deal of ronin turn to a life of crime, stealing or the like. However, due to their previous samurai skills, they are also hired as mercenaries and bodyguards in this time. So it's likely that they would be used for their warrior skills more than anything else.
So the ronin is basically a samurai that's lost his master that has not committed that ritualistic suicide.
Yes.
Correct.
A samurai, after they have lost their lord, is considered dishonored. And the only way that they would be able to return that honor to themselves and to their family members is to commit ritual suicide, which is the only way that you were expected to go about your business after your shogun or your daimyo has died.
So is that the only way for a samurai to lose their master or their daimyo is through death, or was there like any other kind of way?
Typically, a daimyo or a shogun would rule throughout their entire lives, and any samurai that they worked or ruled under or ruled over would follow them, no matter where they went. If they lost a battle and lost land, they would still have their samurai. But if the shogun or daimyo died, then the samurai would be expected to commit ritual suicide so they could maintain their honor.
Is it possible for them to move on to a different daimyo?
Not
Or-
typically,
no.
no, because this is considered dishonorable behavior. It's seen as disloyal.
Okay.
So most samurai, after they've lost their master, go on to either become ronin or commit ritual suicide.
Okay. And basically the only way that they can lose their master is through the master dying.
Yes,
Okay.
that is correct.
Okay.
So that leads us to the samurai, who were a very highly regarded class for their time. It was considered a great honor to be a samurai at this time. And a samurai is basically a warrior who are focused on etiquette and high honor. They were one of the most various classes at this time because they were the only ones who were not expected, but they were able to move up the ladder if they did well enough. Samurai could own land if they were highly regarded, and they could also own slaves at this time. And if their daimyo or shogun were to die of old age, rather, they could decide, I'm going to have this samurai be the one who inherits my land instead of my family, or if they didn't have family. So being a samurai was actually a very good thing back then. They were also known for katanas, which, yes, they were very effective and deadly weapons back at the time, but having a highly decorated katana was a very large status symbol for those back then. Samurai, ronin, daimyo, and shogun all carried katanas as status symbols more than anything else. And there is a great deal of etiquette surrounding how to handle your katana and who to hand it off to in case of your untimely demise or in case of you losing it. Which leads us to the daimyo, who are royal lords. They are the most numerous in terms of royalty, and they are landowners. Each one of them controls at least one small army of samurai. Without an army of samurai, a daimyo is basically nobody. They can't really do anything without, a force of samurai to enforce their will. However, they did no actual fighting themselves. They were rulers more than anything else. And though they were typically generals in their armies, they would sit on the sidelines and command from the side of the battlefield rather than in the midst of it.
How does one become a daimyo or a samurai?
Or
a shogun versus a samurai? Like, how do you move up into that position?
So typically you're either born a daimyo or a shogun, or you are a samurai who did so honorably in battle that a daimyo named you another daimyo, which didn't happen very often, but it did happen occasionally. So it's, like I said before, it's very unlikely that you will ever move up or down on the ladder, because whatever you were born into is likely...
So basically your family's class kind of
Yes.
determines where you are on this pyramid.
Yes, so if you are born as a merchant, it is very unlikely that you will ever move up from being a merchant. You're pretty likely to stay a merchant for the rest of your life.
Okay.
So daimyo are the second strongest in terms of power when it comes to the class system. The only person they actually answered to was the shogun, who ruled over several daimyo, which leads us to the shogun, the most powerful class in terms of the Japanese feudal society. They were landowners. They ruled over several daimyo. They owned several armies of samurai. They are the most powerful, and they are typically the ones who pieces of land of Japan back then would be split amongst. Any land that is owned by a daimyo is also owned by their ruling shogun. So it's a smaller matter of power within those two groups. The daimyo could be landowners and they could own slaves, but any land and slaves and armies that were owned by the daimyo were also ruled by their owning shogun. Now, the shogun would only answer in name to the emperor, but honestly, they more did their own thing than answer to any other ruling power. The only way a shogun could be unseated from their power is if a rival shogun from another nation were to defeat their armies and take over their land. That would be the only way for a shogun to be unseated, or if they were to die of natural causes, in which case their offspring or the most trusted daimyo they ruled over would then become the new shogun. Which leads us to the emperor, who is really only a figurehead of Japanese society, and only a few ruling families would be considered for becoming an emperor. It was mostly a religious title. Most Japanese people back in the feudal era followed Shintoism, and the leader of this religion was typically the emperor. He was a leader and religious figurehead, I should say.
So
And-
both.
Yes,
So he was political and he was religious.
he was a political leader in name only. Emperors really only did ceremonies and went to royal events that they were expected to in the name of tradition. However, other than that, emperors led a posh and sort of comfortable life, as well as the families surrounding them and the advisors that worked in whatever capital was considered to be the capital of Japan at that point. Most of the time, it was Okuyasu, I believe. I don't know, but it was not Tokyo back then. Tokyo was not considered to be the capital for most of the feudal era. So, now that we have looked at the pyramid of Japanese society during the feudal era, I'd like you to consider what it would be like back then to live in this society, to exist in this one class that you would likely live in for the rest of your life. Most people back then would stick with their class. They thought this is the system, there's nothing we can really do to change it, so we might as well make the best we can. But there were some people, like the Ronin, as the strongest example, who fought against the system, who didn't really believe it was just for those who were born in lower positions, and they believed that it led to unjust and unqualified people becoming rulers and ruling their own pieces of land when they really were not the best people to do that. So, consider this. What kind of person would you be in this feudal era? Would you be the kind of person who sticks with what they have, tries to make out the best life they possibly could, and live under the system? Or would you be the kind of person who fights against it, whether in a more open manner, like fighting the system itself, or in a more subdued manner, in which you would try to move your way up the social ladder and try your best to make your life as good for yourself as you possibly could? That is something that I would like you to consider as I end this lecture. These are my sources for the lecture, and I would thank you all for taking this time to learn about Japanese feudalism. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.